Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome to another great episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Cherokee Boos, and today we're going to be looking at how to distinguish between different project phases, the actual standard phases. So we have Mr. Ronnie Wong with us to go ahead and help us through these individual phases. Thank you for joining us today, Ronnie.
Well, thank you for having me on the show as we continue on to take a look at more of the details that we need to understand, of course, for the CompTIA Project Plus certification. And now we're going to dive into the realm of different project phases. Now, if you're coming from the world of the PMI, the Project Management Institute, and the big book of project knowledge, the PMBOK, right, the Project Management Book of Knowledge, you're probably going, wait a minute, what in the world are project phases? I've never heard that term. And you're right. You don't see the term phases usually described inside of the PMBOK or inside of that idea of the PMI world of knowledge, but we're in CompTIA world, and that means you have to learn their terminology as well.
We want to pass CompTIA exams, so we have to learn that information.
Yeah, and you also have to learn their terminology, and that's something we've got to get used to. So if you've heard the term in the PMBOK as a process group, well, that's what we're really talking about today. Is we want to make sure that we have a basic understanding and that we can distinguish each of those different process groups. And we're going to use the term phases because that's what CompTIA calls out as well. Make sure that we actually do hit exactly what we need to understand what's called out. So in every single project management breakdown when it comes down to it, it really is separated out into 5, or well, in this case here, in the newer version of CompTIA's way of doing project, it's actually going to be 6 different phases that we have to take a look at, and we need to know some of the details behind them, and so that's what we're going to take a look at today.
So Ronnie, when you say 6 and you referenced 5, does that mean CompTIA added an additional phase here?
Well, almost. I don't want to say added as much as they took a look at one of the processes, which is the end, right? The end phase that we have normally, and they decided that, look, that's not really the ending, and actually has to do more with, well, getting ready for the next project that comes along. So they separated out and essentially split the 5th one into, well, a 6th one is what they did. So they probably thought that the 5th one, even though I would consider it all the same, it's actually going to be, well, 2 different ones inside of the newer standard when we start taking a look at the newer exam objectives inside of CompTIA's Project Plus. So that's what we're going to also follow as well. So if you're kind of wincing a little bit when you hear me say 6 because you've come from that old world like I did, and you say, no, there's only 5, well, the reality is for this exam, there are 6, and that means if you go with only 5, you're going to be missing something, which is going to be points on your exam. So you don't want to do that. So make sure you do understand that that's where we're actually heading. So that's what we want to begin to take a look at right now, is we want to kind of break down those phases and have a little bit of understanding of each one of those is what we're going to take a look at. Okay. So when we start to begin a project, right, and take a look at the 5 phases that we know, or the 6 phases that we need to know, let's go ahead and take a look at My Machine, and that will help us out to show you what we're talking about in every project management that you actually end up going through as far as managing a project. So here's the different phases that we tend to cover. Now remember, this is from that CompTIA's perspective. So it always begins with the idea of some type of project initiation phase that we go through, which is just initiating the project itself.
So Ronnie, would this be comparable to what the PMBOK has for their first phase, or would this be something a little bit different?
No, this is the one that they really did keep very similar, and they do tend to follow that same aspect, that this is what has to actually be there before we actually begin anything else. So we'll see that, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth. And then from that point, once you actually have that initiation where you've now authorized for the project to really start to form and take place, you then go into the planning phase. Now this is the largest of the actual different phases that we'll be talking about. And even though we're going to be just really doing a slight review, we'll hit some of the concepts more in depth in later episodes. So make sure you pay attention there as we start to break this down, because there's definitely more that's involved here than if you add up all the other phases that we'll be taking a look at as far as the management goes. So this is by far the most complex phase that we'll take a look. Now normally, because of the way that we end up describing it, and we only have to describe it linearly, in other words, that's the only way that we can do it, it's very difficult to kind of show you and tell you that when it comes down to executing the project itself up here, let me see if I can move my arrow so that we can see that. Executing the project, which is just getting the work done on the project and some of the things that have to be managed there. And then, of course, monitoring, or you also hear the term monitoring and controlling a lot of times. Well, even though we tend to say it like this, right? We tend to go, there's an initiation phase, there's a planning phase, there's an execution phase, there's a monitoring phase, there's a closing phase. Even though you tend to hear us say it linearly like that, and that's how we're going to explain it during our show here today. Well, the reality is they're pretty much being carried on simultaneously. As you execute the project, you're actually monitoring at the same time, verifying that things are getting done. You're also implementing different controls if things aren't going exactly the way that you want to. So these two phases, even though we separate them out, they are happening just about simultaneously or very much in sequence, but very quickly one after the other to do that. Okay?
So would it be safe to assume that all of these processes are going, or these phases are pretty standard and you can't omit any of them?
Well, yes and no again, and the reason why is because of the way that we tend to do project management at a small scale, right? So if you're only using a small project and there might be 2 or 3 people, you might find out something that for one reason or another, because you've known those people for a long time, not saying that you should do this, but in a less formalized project management, you might skip over the initiating the project and the planning and just go right into executing. Now, that can cost you some different bits here, okay? You know, it's either time, cost, or requirements. But you can do that, and small companies may end up doing that like, oh no, we know what we really want to accomplish, and they might not plan any of this stuff out. But as your project becomes more complex, as you involve more and more people, you're going to actually realize something. You need to do all these other steps to ensure that you have proper and that you have good uniform management throughout your project as it goes on. Let's go ahead and take a look at my diagram again, and we'll kind of close out here these last 2 here. There's, of course, closing out of the project, which means that, hey, all the project work is going to end up ceasing at that particular point, and that we actually are now delivering the overall project, and that everybody's just about satisfied. And then down here behind my head, there's actually one more here that we call training. Now, this is where it separates out.
Is that you, Ronnie?
I would say that that's me, except that that guy's got more hair than I do. So that guy's a little bit more, you know, he's got a little bit more hair than I do. So I would love to say that that's me, but it's probably not so much me as somebody else that you know, can actually do, you know, all these bullet points that they need to. But the training idea, right, is to take what you've learned from the project and you want to reuse whatever you can. And so you're now actually entering that phase where you might be doing some debriefing, and you're actually trying to make sure that you learn all the benefits that you can from the project closing, from everything else that you've learned, so that you can take that on to the next project as well. So in the PMBOK, they kind of put closing and training together.
Which could go both ways, right? If you could say, look, we did something really well, let's go ahead and incorporate it into our next project, or maybe there are a few things that we didn't do so well that we'd like to, you know, leave out next time.
Yeah, and that's exactly the idea there in terms of the training. And so that's why inside of the Project Plus, they do separate that out. So just remember that as you go on towards your certification, you're going to see 6 instead of 5, which is what most of us are used to, and that's what you'll see. But now we want to go back. I wanted to make sure that we had an overview, okay, of all of those phases before we got started. And so we're going to now take a little bit back here, and we're going to head into that initiation phase, and we're going to talk about that briefly so that we understand what's really going on at this particular point in terms of the project initiation. Okay? Now, in the project initiation phase, sometimes you'll hear people call it pre-project setup. You might hear that term, but it's really the initiation phase that we're talking about, which is that no actual work on the project is being accomplished yet. And there is no authorization to do anything on the project yet as well. Okay? So there has to be some activity that really requires us to say, hey, we want a project to be done. We actually know what needs to be done, and that, you know, we think that it needs to be done as well. So there's a few different activities that lead up to the point of the project being authorized to begin, and that's what the project initiation phase or initiating phase really does for us. Now, when we start to talk about that idea, okay, so Cherokee, if I were to say that we need a project, what's one of the things that you might think about that I would be saying? What's usually the question if I walked into your office and said, we need to do a project? What would you want to know first of all?
Who is doing the project?
Well, yeah, you might want to know who's doing the project. And since I walked into your office, guess who's doing the project?
Ronnie.
No. That
Oh,
would be
man, I
you.
thought we were going to get lucky.
Yeah, that would be you, okay? So you're now trying to take a look at some of the overviews of things that might need to be done at that point. In other words, who might actually do it. But the other thing is, Cherokee, one of the things that I might actually, hopefully I would think that you would ask is, okay, Ronnie, what project do we need to do? In other words, you want to identify.
There we go.
Yeah, that would be strange if I walked right in and said, Cherokee, you're going to do this project, and I would think that you'd go, hey, what are we talking about here? What project do I really want to do at this point? And you might have more questions than that. Well, that's when you ask the questions. Cherokee, I'd hate to think that you would say, let's do this, and you don't have a clue what we're talking about doing, and then you go, by the way, what are we doing now that we're a few days into it? That would be a little bit behind the 8 ball at that point, and I think you might actually find yourself a little bit more challenged in terms of project.
It's happened.
Oh, yeah, who hasn't it happened to? Okay, so yes, we've all been in those situations in which you do jump first before you actually ask the questions. But in project management, though, Cherokee, we're talking about management here.
Yes,
we want to begin.
Let's be smart about it. Let's approach it methodically here.
Yeah, that's the key, right? Is to go, all right, let's make sure we know what we want to do first. So one of those particular activities that we want to make sure that we do is that we identify what that project actually is going to be so that we can actually assign resources to it so that we can now actually start working on the project. Very difficult to work on something when you don't really know what you're supposed to be working on. I think that makes sense.
It does. It really does.
Yeah. So the other thing, of course, then, is that, hey, one of the other questions that Cherokee should ask, right? So let's say that what I say is, I'm trying to think of a great one right off the top of my head. I can't think of anything great.
I'm going to ask you who's paying for this project.
Okay, yeah, that might actually be another one that we actually have to think about here. Okay?
I don't know if that's a topic, but
Yeah, well,
definitely.
it's a good one that we can actually include in this particular, and this is a good time for us to ask, right? We shouldn't be asking it as we're spending money, like, hey, who's paying for this? And I go, well, Cherokee, don't you have a couple of dollars that you can lend me as we begin this project? Well, again, who hasn't been caught in that either, but that's not what we want to do. So we might actually go, all right, here's who's going to pay for it, and here's who's authorized this as well. But the other thing is that when you start hearing whatever project it is, one of the key things that should go off in our heads, whether we're actually the project sponsor, which we've talked about in another episode here, whether we're the project manager or the project champion, it should be validating that project. In other words, do we really need this project or not? Okay? That's kind of a decision that should happen not while the project is going on, but before the project goes on. Is this something that we can get by without, or is this something that we really need? It's not that every single project is always based on necessity, okay? Even though a lot of projects are.
Are you really referencing the soft serve ice cream in the break room, the machine, the project?
I don't know if I am or not. That's a good one, though. So Cherokee will assign you with that one.
Okay.
And see what happens there. But that would be neat to have that soft serve ice cream right there. I wonder, who are you talking to now? That's what I want to know, because I definitely don't have the authorization to do that. So at this point, though, you'd actually need to validate that, right? Does this really need to be a project? You might find out something even at this particular phase here. So Cherokee might come to me and say, whoa, Ronnie, before we kind of dive into that idea of soft serve ice cream and buying an ice cream machine so that we can have that, don't get me wrong, sounds cool, but she might go, or I might actually say, well, we could do that, but then Cherokee goes, but, we could also go across the street and maybe buy ice cream, okay? So that might actually be easier overall. And so you might find out something, that the project that you have might be a great project in mind, but you might find out something. This already exists and it's cheaper overall. You actually don't need it because there's a convenient, a replacement of whatever that project might be.
Yeah, that's how all my ideas end up turning out.
Well, that's not so bad when it comes down to what time, cost, and resources here, where you might find out something. Yeah, I really don't need to take a lot of my resources away and spend a lot of money and spend a lot of time in building that when it's already there. It's sort of like the people that you know, and you always hear the same notion in every business book that you read, right? don't reinvent the wheel, okay? Don't reinvent the wheel. Cherokee, what do we mean by that when we say we don't want to reinvent the wheel?
I probably wouldn't want to put forth effort and, give my resources to something that I really didn't need to. Maybe I could use my resources for something that was a little more important.
Yeah, and that's the key, right? Is that if you're in the middle of this idea of initiating a project, the key term there is, hey, let's validate this first. Do we really need it? And we might find out something. We're just reinventing the wheel, and the wheel's been around for a long time, so maybe I shouldn't need to reinvent that thing unless I really had a special need for something else. But overall, though, that's what we don't want. So we now have started to talk about a few different activities, right? We want to find out some information, right? Who's going to be essentially the primary stakeholders here, okay? Who's paying for it? Who's really got their vested interest in this idea? Does this project need to exist? What is this project as we start to take a look at it? So there's a lot of different ones. And you might find out something also in a larger company in terms of the initiation phase, okay? Is you get together with a bunch of other project managers and all of a sudden you find out that there's 5 or 6 projects that are out there, and what they're looking for is the project that really needs to be done. So that's why this phase is very important. You might go, let's start all 5. Well, why start all 5? Okay? Again, that's where that validation comes in. Who's going to pay for this? That's also a part of it, And you might find yourself, as you start going through, that you select only one of those projects instead of every single project to get started on. And so that initiation phase really does help us out when we start to ask and start to try and figure out how do we get through this initiation phase. So it's a big part of doing due diligence at this point before we go ahead and go, let's just throw caution to the wind and we're just going to start this project. And I go, why are we doing this? Because I want to. Well, that's not a great validation at all. It just means I'm doing what I want to do.
So, Ronnie, in different methodologies that I know are out there, different study methods, there are some tools available for us to use. Does CompTIA offer any kind of suggestions for different types of tools to help us through this initiation phase?
Well, a lot of the tools that are available have to really do at this point here with skill and expertise more than anything else. So that's why it actually does need to be in the initiation phase, right? The very beginning, usually at least a project sponsor, okay, and a project manager, and probably the project champion if you have that, and maybe even just a few other people to help validate or to help kind of raise questions that you didn't think about overall, okay? So this is where it gives us that idea of what we call expert judgment is what it really boils down to. The very fact is that with that group of people, you might find people poking holes in, well, Cherokee's idea of having a soft serve ice cream machine,
No.
In our break room here. And she might go, oh, yeah, I get it, and this is what it might end up being. But you might find that. You can also have where people over time, right, have developed different worksheets. So as they gather together and they go, here's a project we want to do, instead of just trying to brainstorm, even though that's a proper technique that you can come up with multiple ideas and do things with, you might go ahead and make it a little bit more directed in terms of where you might lead some type of group discussion on it, or it might be multiple worksheets where you tell people what the idea is and they start writing down those elements that they need to figure this thing out together. So you might see those as actually being kind of the primary tools that we need.
Ronnie, before we get started in the planning phase, are there any kind of results or outputs that we need to take away from the initiation phase?
There definitely does need to be some real tangible results that we take away from this initiation phase, or we'll never get to the planning phase, and there's several reasons for that. Now, one of the key ideas, right, is that the initiation phase itself is really a big meeting of sorts with the people that are really going to be making kind of the major decisions for the project to continue on, as well as for the project to develop in the way that it needs to. And one of the things that I really do not like is when we have a meeting and I have to ask a question at the end of the meeting, what in the world, was accomplished by that meeting. So there should be some type of output, some type of result that should come from the meeting. And one of those results actually is the key result that we have here, which is what we call a project charter. The project charter is by far the most important document that we come away from, and I mean a document, and that means that it's actually in writing. That's actually the key here, that says that this project is now authorized to continue forward, okay? Without that, the planning phase doesn't go on. The execution doesn't go on, monitoring, controlling, closing, training, none of that goes on. So at the end of the initiation phase, if there's one element that I want us to take from this, one hard piece of documentation that's in writing, it's going to be that. If we can't get that, the project is not going to proceed, so we really don't need to go any further than that. A lot of times, along with that project charter, of course, is making sure that we understand what the business case is for doing it. You have to get people on board, and that means on your side if you're going to do this during the project initiation. You cannot expect that you're going to turn somebody at the initiation phase where when they leave this meeting, they're like, yeah, I don't see it. I just not really into this idea. You need to make sure that you make the proper business case so it actually motivates them that this is something that really is going to be, that's going to justify them taking time and effort out of whatever they're doing to also be on this project as well. The other things that we also tend to need to have, of course, are things like the scope at a high level, right? The definition of what that scope is going to be. What is the scope of the project? What are our project limitations here? Now, this is not technical scope, okay? Now, what we mean by this is that we need that high overview of what we really want to see accomplished by this project, and there should be that. There should be some written form of something that says, here was what we really want to see accomplished by this project. And if we don't have that, it's very difficult for somebody to envision that, to grab a hold of that, so that the project can actually continue and do what we want to. And finally, of course, we need to make sure that at least during this meeting, that somebody has brought up the high-level risks that are at play here. What is this going to cause to our company? Is this actually going to be some type of contentious issue within our company? What do we need to do, or what don't we need to do? What do we need to avoid? We need to have at least that consideration, and that everybody in the initiation phase needs to agree to it. And then once all that's done, we can then sign that project charter, and that's when we now are authorized to essentially move on to that project planning phase is what we'll end up seeing. So just kind of realize that, yeah, there has to be some outcome.
And guys, if you've never been a project manager before, this is the first time kind of spearheading a project, don't be afraid to go online and search for some of these tools. Like Ronnie mentioned that your project charter is an actual document. I found project charters online, the templates in like Microsoft Word, so definitely use the internet as a tool as well.
Yeah, there's no doubt that there's plenty of material out there in terms of project management, and project managers that are out there on the internet creating their own blogs, they are about as helpful of a group of people as you'll find. And the reason why is that they really want this idea of project management because it really is an art and a science. They want you to understand all of it. And so they're very helpful when you do need help. And you'll see a lot of people have made templates to help you out in terms of what the project charter should be. They'll even have again, worksheets that you work through. You might even see guidelines for walking through this idea of the project initiation phase as well, making sure that everything's on hand in the way that needs to be. But those are kind of the elements that we need to pull together from that initiation phase, and if we can't do that, right, then we shouldn't end up with the result of at least the project charter. We might actually make the entire business case. We might have actually considered every single risk. We might have actually even talked about all the things that we feel like we need to talk about, but in the end result, we might have figured out something that nobody is willing to authorize this. And that can be for many reasons, when it comes down to it. And so you always have to take that into consideration, okay? So just remember that everything in terms of projects, right, when it comes down to it, it actually does boil down to, well, three things that we have to make sure that we manage completely here. And this is where it begins, right? So every discussion that we have, okay, as far as a project manager goes, he's always trying to get these things in balance. And the reason why is that everybody always wants, well, three goals for whatever they're doing, right? They want whatever they're doing to be good, they want it to be fast, and they want it to be cheap. As cliche as I can get it, it's fairly simple, right? If you want it to be cheap, guess what? You're probably not going to actually have good or fast. Yeah. You want it to be fast, you're probably not going to have good and cheap. You want it to be good, you're probably not going to have fast and cheap. And so when you talk about the idea of constraints, well, that's kind of a very layman's term of constraints that in project management, we tend to actually put it in what we call a constraint triangle here, in which we talk about the idea of time, scope, as well as cost to help us out, that we need to keep those things in balance. If I'm only worried about the idea of cost, well, that means what? Time and scope, okay? They actually are not going to be, they're going to suffer when I actually focus on one. Same thing as we focus on time, same thing as we focus on scope. We're not going to see all that. And that's just a basic. We're going to go over this idea of the constraint triangle a little bit more in detail further on, but just kind of realize that even at this stage, okay, the project manager, this is what's in his background, in his head. Say, hey, is this all possible? Can we do this? And he really is helping to make sure that all this is managed in the way that needs to be. But it's right here that we really begin that concept of project management, is in that initiation phase. So we want to make sure that we take care of that very well.
And it looks like we've reached one of our constraints. Time, yay! We actually were able to go ahead and cover one of the 6 phases here. So stay with us, guys. Thank you for joining. We're going to take a look at more Project Plus phases with Mr. Ronnie Wong. But I'm Cherokee Booth,
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
signing off, and have a great day.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.